Great. Good afternoon, morning, and evening to member of Knesset, Merav Michaeli. I see that people are logging in, so I will just give it a moment just to make sure. Merav, you had a very long day yesterday in the Knesset, which we will get to. So it's really a privilege to have you here.
Me, it's always a pleasure.
And I think I will start, and people can continue logging in. My name is Adina Vogel-Ayalon, and I am J Street's Israel director. Happy to be back here on JStream, kicking off a new series of webinars on JStream focused on women in politics. This series comes to you on the heels of the announcement of Kamala Harris as the Democratic Party's nominee for vice president, the first woman of color on a presidential ticket. In light of this historic moment, over the next few weeks, we will be highlighting the topic of women in politics through a series of webinars, highlighting women who are fighting to create political change. And there is no better person to start this series with than member of Knesset, Merav Michaeli. I know that I, among many other Israeli women and men, look up to you and the leadership that you have shown in and out of the Knesset. MK Michaeli is a very close friend to J Street, a real progressive leader in the Knesset, and a true advocate for the necessity of promoting a diplomatic resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. She is known today as Labor's one-woman opposition and proudly upholds the reputation of being a feminist firebrand. Merav, we are very grateful to have the opportunity to hear from you today about the topic of women in politics. And specifically their political representation in Israel and the barriers that women face today in this field. We also hope to get your take on the current political moment in Israel and how you see the future of the Israeli left and the Labor Party. And I want to take a minute to formally introduce you to some of our viewers who may be less familiar with your bio. There's a lot of important achievements to cover, but I'm going to run through just some of the highlights. So, member of Knesset Merav Michaeli has been a member of the Knesset since the 19th Knesset in 2013. Between 2015 and 19, she served as the opposition whip for the Zionist Union. Since her election to the Knesset, she has served on several committees, including the Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee. And just last week, she was recently appointed as the chair of the subcommittee for the fight against women trafficking. For over 20 years, MK Michaeli has been involved in feminist activism, seeking to promote women's equality and opportunity, as well as the rights of minorities, labor rights, and the peace process. Her leadership in the Knesset has led her to be ranked as one of the most socially oriented legislators. And prior to her election to the Knesset, Merav Michaeli was a senior journalist at Haaretz. She also edited and hosted news and entertainment programs on the TV and radio. And in 1997, in 1997, she founded Ezrat Nashim, a nonprofit organization whose mission is to provide support for victims of sexual assault. And today she serves also as a member of the management board of the Israel Women's Network. A lot more to say, but I will stop there, and I will begin with a moderated discussion before opening it up to questions from our viewers. So I encourage you throughout this first part of the conversation to put your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we will get to them about midway through the discussion. So, Merav, I want to start the conversation by diving right into the challenges that women face in Israel today with regard to their ability to enter politics. Today, just some statistics, there are 33 women members of Knesset out of 120, and there are no political parties today that are currently led by women. And according to a recent report, Israel ranks 83rd out of 189 members of the Interparliamentary Union with regard to women's representation in the legislature, and 27th out of 36 members of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. So I want to ask you to lay out for us what you see the major challenges for women entering into the political sphere today. Do you see a connection between wage gaps and socioeconomic factors as one of these obstacles? How would you define the challenges, the most pressing challenges today?
Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning, that is, and thank you again for having me. It's always a pleasure to be among J Street friends. And, you know, I'm listening to you and I'm thinking that the first thing we need to mention, and I don't think we are mentioning this enough, is that we are now in the midst of what should have been the huge celebration of the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States that gave us, women, the right to vote. I mean, I don't, for sure in Israel, this is something that is not taught at all. But I know that even in America, that generally speaking, Americans do learn their history quite thoroughly. But somehow this chapter is kind of missing. It's not part of the same curriculum as is the rest of American history. And I am mentioning that because it reflects the complexity and the shortage in our current status. Often, not only we are mistaken to think that equality is already here, but God knows that patriarchy and men in power would like to give us the notion that not only is it already equal, but that the pendulum has gone way too far to the other side and that women are whatever too much. And looking back, realizing that it's been only 100 years, along which we've made huge progress, unbelievable progress. We should be so extremely proud of ourselves, of our mothers, of our ancestors, and the fights that they waged and the accomplishments that they managed to achieve. At the same time, we need to realize that this should have been so much more celebrated. And not only celebrated, but taught, mostly taught. Taught because the fight is so far from being over. And the representation of women in politics, not, you talk about Israel, but I don't think the numbers in America are any better. Actually, I think the representation in Senate is poorer. Representation in Congress is, I think, similar in numbers or in percentage, actually, not in numbers, but in percentage. And the polarization that is so evident that most of the women who manage to get into are on one side of the political map, generally speaking. And on the other side, it's still almost, I mean, very close to impossible to get in. It goes to show how far we are from equality, how far we are from being able to make this vote tangible in every sphere of life. So I think for me, it's often very important to tell progressive Americans that there's always been similarity and closeness between the dynamics and the characteristics of Israeli society and American society, and especially the progressive societies, I think. But in the last 4 years, it's important that you realize, I know that you are very much consumed with the worry and the outrage and the fight against your president and everything he stands for and the things that he does. But it's important for me to make you realize that this is exactly the kind of politics that we have been dealing with in Israel ever since 2009, that's many more years in a row. Just think what it would have looked like had you been living under the presidency of Donald Trump ever since 2009. And it's important for me to emphasize this to you, because I think, I know from my very close relationship with you and my friends, my progressive friends in America, that often you did not understand how come we constantly fail in pushing forward a resolution to the conflict, in standing up to the damages to democracy, to equality, all of the above. But I think now, maybe you can understand us better. And one of the lenses through which we can look at this as see is women's status, and see the backlash that this kind of politics brings to women. It brings to not only to women, to minorities, to all kinds of perceptions and beliefs that we have on the world and on society, etc. But especially on women, this kind of politics and these people bring an overwhelming backlash to the achievements that we already have, and of course to the challenges that are facing us. So there's a lot of similarity, not only in the numbers, not only in, I would say, the dynamics, but again, the challenges. So I'm thinking, I want to sort of, because, you know, women in politics is not something that's separate from the life of women, obviously. I mean, as everything else, it also, it reflects women's status and the possibilities that stand in front of women. And of course, it has an impact on what women's life and possibilities look like. And I think if you look like on the big picture, then the last big feminist wave that America went through was somewhere in the 60s and the 70s of the previous century. While in Israel, we only started doing politics in the public sphere in mid-90s, when I had the privilege and the good fortune of igniting that public revolution, feminist talk and feminist culture that really was very, very successful. Generally speaking, I think we've managed to reach a point where people in Israel think that there should be gender equality. But, and there's this huge but, there's a huge gap between what the majority of Israelis believe should be and even want the reality to be, and what politics allows reality to become. This gap is just constantly growing, unbelievably. Not only is it not shrinking, but it's widening. And so we have had the thing when Adina mentioned that I started this organization called Ezrat Nashim in 1996, it was actually the first time ever that someone, especially what I was then at the time, a very young woman who's very well known, very successful on television, wearing very short miniskirts, not only speaking about rape, but also saying that she's a feminist. This was like, there were no such things as feminists walking the earth in Israel at the time. Now it's so much more common on one hand, and we really have succeeded in really changing the reality of sexual assault and sexual harassment in Israel. Not that we're through with it, but major changes have happened. And still, we can't get the government to budget and to implement the basic programs required to fight and to battle the violence against women. What the equivalent of the Violence Against Women's Act that Joe Biden as vice president was heavily involved in passing, we do not have yet, nothing of the sort. Now, again, I don't have the tools to know how effective it is in action, in practice, the act. But I know that here, despite huge protests on the street, women have taken to the streets in tens of thousands, and men, by the way, men who identify and who are partners to the cause, and still we can't get it done because we have a government that is very chauvinistic, very patriarchic, very religious in the patriarchic way, not that we have anything against religion, obviously. So this is also the reality in which we work in Parliament. We are still a minority, which is dramatic for our ability to pass things that are relevant for women, for women's rights, for equality in general, gender equality and otherwise. Also, you know how we had the golden, it's always like that. In the beginning, the pioneers create a sort of golden era when you have the women who do manage to get in are usually very feminist, very convicted, and highly capable. And then when it becomes more acceptable, then you start getting a variety of women who are not necessarily very feminist, whom this cause is not necessarily very high up their priorities, and that are not necessarily that capable. Now, being a minority, that also is true for the US, but certainly in a coalition regime, sort of, women find themselves time and again voting against things that they deeply believe in and would have loved to vote for, but cannot because of coalition discipline, which has turned into a tool that Netanyahu is abusing, no less than abusing. So this is where we are in terms of inside politics. Now, let's talk about getting into politics. You in America have this beautiful thing that is called Emily's List. We don't. Now, why was Emily's List created? From understanding that one of the biggest barriers for women is money. According to the UN report on women from 2015, would you like to try and guess how all of the money and the assets in the world are divided between men and women? What in percentage? How much and how much? Who would like to guess?
I guess I'm the only one that has the privilege to guess, unless someone wants to write it into the Q&A box. But I can wait, or I can 20% for women, 5%, 1%. Wow.
99.1. You know, when during the Bernie campaign, the previous campaign, not this one, but the one when he ran against Hillary Clinton, I gave an interview to Jezebel, the website, American website Jezebel. And they said, you know, young women do not understand why they should be voting for a woman candidate. They are more worried about the 99%. They are more worried about the inequality in income, about the 1% and the 99%. And I said, you know what? Why doesn't anyone talk about this 1% versus the 99%? This is the 1% and the 99% that we as women should be at least aware of. We get up every morning and the 1% of the money and the assets in the world is what we are supposed to live on. All of the women in the world. Now, of course, you know, personally, none of us feel that. Certainly, none of the men in your lives feel that. That is obvious. But this is the big picture. We have so many less women with money, with major money, with money that can make a difference. We have so few women who are economically and financially independent. We still have a huge wage gap. In Israel, it is bigger than it is in the US. In the US, I think last I checked, it was 27%. In Israel, it's 35. I can, I'm worried that this gap may grow post-coronavirus crisis, because I know that in Israel, more women were fired than men. Certainly, more women have lost their jobs than men have. So obviously, it's not only about the money for the campaign. It's politics is a work with zero occupational security, zero occupational security. And it costs. I mean, yes, you are, even if as a member of Knesset, I am thankfully getting paid, but I will always have more expenses just to be able to be efficient enough. I am in Israel, thankfully, I'm not allowed to raise money. Our politics, formally, it is without the sicknesses of being able to raise money all the time. But it doesn't matter, because the day-to-day of being able to even, take care of a household, grow children, you have to have the support system that costs money. Most women do not have that support system. That is even before we talk about the stereotypes. This is even before we talk about, I think the most major sort of seen through thing is that still in our culture, politics is about power. It's about owning power. Power is not feminine. The strongest you are, the more power you have, the less feminine you are considered. This is something that deteriorates many, many women. This is where we still are.
That was
a long answer. I never intended it to be so long.
It was a very broad question that allowed, and you covered a lot of what I wanted you to cover, and you covered a lot of what I wanted you to cover in the next question. But you touched on something very specific.
I just want to say one more thing, if you will, please.
Yeah, please.
I just want to say that yes, we have less women with money, and we have less men who will support women candidates. It is very hard for a woman who runs for office to find men who will support her seriously, financially, because the word leadership, especially in Hebrew, that is so genderized, but I think to a large extent also even in English, where it's as if neutralized, leadership still means manhood. It's when you say leader, you still see the suit. And this would be, I think, the biggest barrier we still are facing.
So I wanted to ask you, you touched on the challenge that that we faced in the past, 11 years under this government, what it means in terms of coalition, discipline, and the barriers in terms of passing legislation. I would love for you to address, how can we address some of these obstacles despite those barriers, specifically in the Knesset with those limitations, and when there is the inability to pass legislation or to promote these causes in the Knesset, what type of role do you see the Israeli public and civil society playing, and how can they, fill that void of what you have identified as this barrier or obstacle in the Knesset?
First of all, listen, we've made huge progress in terms of legislation. It's not that we're not behind so much in terms of legislation. We're not progressive. We were not so much behind. What I was talking about is budgeting and actually implementing, which is something that does not belong so much to the parliament, but to the government. And that is, you know, if we have a minority in the party, in parliament, we are a smaller minority within the government, of course. So the only way to make this difference is through changing politics, electing not only more women, which is of course important, but representation isn't everything. The most important thing is realizing that activism is extremely important, but it has to lead to politics. And it's not enough to lobby once you have already the members of Knesset or the ministers, whatever. Yes, lobbying is important. It's more important to try and get to people to realize what their vote means, the connection between their vote and women's rights is, that there is one. Because generally speaking, people find it hard to understand how their vote actually affects their lives. You know that, it's not unique for Israel. I think today, the civil society on the center left, the progressive side, should move much more to, it's not advocacy, it's actually propaganda. It's working on people not to convince people that equality is important, because as I said, thankfully, when you survey the general public in Israel and you talk about the issues themselves, the content, not the political representation. If you talk about the issues, you will find that there is a huge majority for Israel that is democratic, for civil equality, for gender equality, for gay rights, for freedom of religion, all of those, of course, for a welfare state, and even still a small majority that supports the two-state solution. Even after all these years of incitement and delegitimization by Netanyahu, still a majority, a small majority that supports the two-state solution. But the connection between this and the vote hardly exists. This is what we should be working on today. God knows the right is doing this, like on a huge scale, they're doing it. They have tons of money invested in all kinds of media vessels, big and small, conservative media vessels and new media, digital media and social networks and all of those. They have a network of institutions that constantly creates narratives and markets them and affects the public. We don't have that network, unfortunately. That, you know, is back to money, of course. But not only. Problem with the center-left camp in Israel is that it's been subjected to violence from the right ever since Benjamin Netanyahu stepped into the public political arena in Israel in '93 and started the fight, the incitement, the delegitimization of Yitzhak Rabin and Oslo, and introduced to Israeli public the narrative that the right is good for the Jews and the left is good for the Arabs. You know, younger Israelis, like my staff, for instance, okay, they're 25 years old, they cannot understand what I'm telling them when I'm telling them that the word left did not always exist in Israel. I grew up in a country where this, I mean, yes, there was right and left. It was a non-issue. And they can't get it. Now, the center-left camp is so beaten and has internalized the blame so much that there's a constant apologetic disposition that we are in. Part of the reason why the civil society organizations are very careful from being political. That also goes for the feminist organizations. Yes, they're very feminist, but they would not be political because it's like this curse. You can be political if you're on the right, but not if you're on the left. or not even left, but just liberal. We need to work on those things because, as I said, women's rights is not a standalone. You can't separate women's rights from general equality, from freedom of religion, from peace. We know that from historical experience all over the world. Equality and peace go together. They advance one another. Where there's no peace, there's less chance for equality. Where there's no equality, there's less chance for peace. So the two they go together, and we have to work on them together. And that is why, in my WhatsApp status, it says equality and peace. To me, peace is one of the major feminist causes. And so we just need to realize that all of that cannot happen without us investing in politics.
That's a really great segue into one of the next topics that I wanted to specifically ask you about, which is national security and women representation within the national security diplomacy and the peace process. And I know that you have been a leader on these issues in the Knesset. You were the co-chair for the Caucus for Israel's Security, which was very vocal recently in the struggle to prevent unilateral annexation. But it's very clear that there is a lack of female representation in decision-making positions in this field. And just recently there were petitions by several civil society organizations regarding the lack of women representation on the team appointed to deal with the coronavirus pandemic. What can be done in order to get more women in these positions? Understanding the culture within Israel in terms of the military as being sort of that base for election, or sort of that's the natural path is coming from the military into this national security field. How do you see this, and how do you see an opportunity, or is there an opportunity to get more women in these types of positions?
Again, it all comes down to political will. Now, I have to tell you that one of the fights that I've been fighting for many, many years is the fight for equality within Israeli army. I mean, one of the myths in the past about Israel was that there is gender equality in Israel because of three reasons: because of Golda, because of the kibbutz, and because of the draft, because we had mandatory draft for everyone, including women. Now, the draft still is mandatory, but there is no equality or opportunities once you enlist. Now, this is just unbearable, just so unacceptable. The amazing thing is that there was a report that was ordered by the IDF and recommended already in 2007, that is 13 years ago, recommended to the IDF to move from checking people according to their sex or gender, but to move to checking them according to their abilities and talents. This was never accepted. In the meantime, the US Army did that, the British Army did it, and the IDF is left the only modern army in the West that did not fully apply equal opportunity for all. Now, this, of course, has a major bearing on women's status post their army service, because we have traditionally seen, as we do now, we have two former chiefs of staff who have been the promise of the recent elections. Doesn't matter that they're also the disappointment, the betrayal, the failure of this elections, but the 3 rounds of elections. So the easiness that former people from the army, given the militaristic culture and also the reality that puts security issues in the center of the agenda all the time. The sort of easy segue it gives to men from the army to public life in Israel is not available to women. And is not available to women, not only to politics, but every time there's like a round of fighting in Gaza or some bombing or something happens, in a heartbeat, you see all the women disappear from the studios of the televisions, and only men fill the studios for like the first days, I would say. And the fact that I have been on the Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee, not only, but on 2 of the major subcommittees for all of my time in the Knesset is not good enough to get me in to the conversation, because it's so masculine exclusive. A member of Knesset, Yuli Tamir, whom you probably know, and former member of Knesset, Eti Livni, who's now one of the leaders of Women Wage Peace, when they were in the Knesset in the 2000s, they passed legislation inspired by Resolution 1325 of the UN Security Council that demands that women would be at least a third of any team dealing with life, death, war, peace, because realizing that women and girls and children have different needs and specific points of views on these situations, and that their engagement, that women's engagement brings the chances of reaching agreements much higher. So we have legislation that demands that at least 25% of every such team will consist of women. I don't know how to tell you this, but our Prime Minister is not necessarily following the law in general, and also not in this case. So often people are taking organizations, feminist organizations are taking it to the Supreme Court. And sometimes the Supreme Court will interfere and force whoever to appoint or nominate one more woman or here or there. But again, if we want to change the reality in a profound way, it will have to go through politics.
So thank you for that answer. And I'm mindful of the time, and also the fact that we have several questions that are all touching on one topic that I'm sure you can guess what it is. As I mentioned you as the one woman opposition. But I'm going to combine a bunch of our viewers' questions together, especially as it also relates to a question that I wanted to ask you, which is regarding the future of the Labour Party. And of course, we are not headed into elections yet, but there have been several polls that have been conducted recently, talking about showing essentially that the Labour Party doesn't necessarily pass the threshold. And so there's a bunch of questions here about the future of the Labour Party. One, how do you envision rehabilitating voters? How do you envision garnering more support? Is it even possible to reinvigorate the Labour Party today? Can you touch on some of those questions?
Well, the future of labor still, needs to be written. It really is unknown, because you're of course correct that labor in the polls is not passed, is way under the threshold. And it's been like that ever since it made a decision to go into Netanyahu's government, to betray its promises and its commitments, its repeated commitments to not sit with Netanyahu, under Netanyahu. They have. I have really fought a really, really very, very powerful fight with the majority of the members of the party, I have to admit. But the convention, the center of the party, ultimately supported Amir Peretz's decision to join the party, even though, again, the majority of the members were strongly against it. So the party is in a weird situation right now. It was kind of kidnapped into this government. And from the minute this happened, it's not passing the threshold, and rightfully so. You know, why would anyone vote for a party that is just yet the whatever two last ministers in a government that has many two ministers as it is, and that is against everything it's supposed to stand for? The future of labor depends first and foremost on the ability to take it out of the government, hold primaries, replace the leadership, and start rebuilding it. Now, I believe that the potential there is huge. Listen, the center-left camp in Israel is crushed and devastated like it's never been before, and God knows it's been through some stages. We have about 1.5 million voters, heartbroken, betrayed, disappointed, who really have no address right now, have no leadership, have no one to represent them, have no one who tells them the truth and follows what they're actually promising and saying. All of these people need this address, need this leadership. I believe it should be built on the infrastructure of labor. The DNA of labor is strongly connected to the DNA of the state of Israel. The good with the bad. The good we need to reconstruct, take it back to the original Zionism, which was equality. It was a welfare state. It was striving for peace. These are the three main elements that we should restore and we should repossess. And the bad, we have to fix. The wrongs that were done, we should come up with new ideas, with new solutions. It's completely possible. It's completely doable. We should take back the narrative of Zionism, rephrase it, and give people the confidence that they can trust us and not go back to doing what labor was doing so many times in the last 20 years, getting into so many right-wing governments and serving right-wing politicians and right-wing policies. That is why it is so, this is why it is where it is now. I strongly believe this is doable. Renewing the brand is something that I'm less worried about. People like renewed brands. I mean, look around you, how many people are wearing Converse shoes or hush puppies or whatever? I mean, as far as brands go, brands that were more dead than labor have come back to life. But first we need to really reconstruct the party itself. I am very heavily invested in this fight because there's no way I can accept that someone will just take labor with all its glorious past and its, I mean, think about it, the party of Ben Gurion and Rabin and the legacy that it has and the contribution it has to Zionism and to the state of Israel, to just take it and erase it into blue and white, to me, it's unacceptable, and I'm going to fight it as hard as I possibly can. I cannot promise that I will succeed, but if I don't, then we'll have to discuss the alternative. But right now I'm invested in this, so I don't even want to think about the alternative.
So I shouldn't ask you the questions, the subsequent questions about potential opportunities for joining with other parties and finding that as sort of the alternative route, also joining with Arab parties, and your opinion on those alternative routes for rebuilding the left. Should I not ask you, or can I ask you?
No, it's okay. Listen, cooperation with, first of all, the attitude towards the Arab society in Israel, this is the main thing that should change, of course. And generally speaking, we did not mention it, but I will just say briefly that I believe that the two biggest potentials of Israel are the Arab society and the Orthodox society. two societies that under Netanyahu are constantly excluded. I don't know if you remember that Netanyahu, following one of the OECD's reports on the Gini criteria, the inequality criteria that is the highest in Israel in all of the OECD, he said, what do you want? If you deduct Arabs and ultra-Orthodox, we're doing just great. So he's constantly deducting Arabs and ultra-Orthodox. And once we get to power and we start including them in every possible way, not only economically speaking, but also in terms of culture and in terms of participation in civil society and really respect and equality, it's going to alter Israeli society in the best possible way. So, of course, this is extremely important, but, and this is major, what Israeli politics, and especially Israeli politics on the left and the center left, needs is a functioning political body that is able to form coalition and a government. This is what we lack. This was Labor's historic role. This is what it abandoned. We have no alternative to Labor in that sense, you know, is created. Blue and white, God knows, are not. Kadima is gone. Whatever attempts were made, none of them survived. This is the major thing that we are lacking, and this is the most important thing to build. Because without it, it's very important to have a cooperation with the Arab society and its representatives, but you need the body that can do it.
And, you know, talking about the body that can do it, and, you know, the fact that just yesterday you had a very, very long day in the Knesset, and I was following, I saw your speech on the Knesset floor regarding the compromise, the bill of the compromise that postponed the deadline for passing the 2020 budget until the end of December. And you were very clear with in your opposition to that bill. I would love for you to tell us a bit about why, and, you know, where do you see the future of this political moment right now?
Listen, going to a fourth election is of course crazy, but this government is crazier. It's so bad. I mean, it was created as if to handle the coronavirus crisis and the economical crisis that follows. It only worsened both. There is nothing good that they're doing. I mean, the financial and economical situation in Israel is the worst that it's been probably, I mean, ever, in the sense of the number of unemployed, the loss in the GDP, the everything. I mean, it's really amazing. While at the same time, I mean, we're paying this price and we don't achieve any control of the pandemic. So, and at the same time, that they were giving, I mean, it's hard to me to even, you know, it's so frustrating. They have given Netanyahu both the legitimacy and the possibility to continue bashing and destroying the major foundations and the pillars of our democracy. This is no cliche. This is really happening. The attack, not only, I mean, started with the media, it goes on with the Attorney General, it goes on with the court. It's about the police, depends on who's endangering Netanyahu at a given time. But the erosion of the democracy and the trust, the public trust in those institutions, and those institutions' ability to function under such heavy and severe attack is so horrible. And they are allowing it, they are enabling it. So by all means, it's better to dismantle this government and to go to another elections. I'm not sure what will happen in such elections. I just know that it's impossible to continue giving Netanyahu the legitimacy and this supplying him with the ground to continue acting and doing what he's been doing from this place. Now, this compromise, what it does is just postponing. I don't know, maybe by 100 days, maybe by 50 days, maybe by 150 days. It's all up to Netanyahu. They have left him with all of the options. It's all in his hands. They have no leverage, none whatsoever. Nobody does, actually, because in his party, everybody's giving in to him as well. Why give him yet again more leverage? This is why I was so against this bill, of course. So we'll have to wait and see when is the next time Netanyahu is going to start rolling the dice of the yes or no elections this time. One of his favorite sports.
I'm gonna take just a few more minutes because we started a few minutes late. So I'm gonna ask you two final questions. One is that I see that you've also been, you've been out in the protests, on the bridges, in the streets, and you made a point to be very supportive and vocal of these protests against this government. What do you see the impact, or how do you see these protests as having an impact in the long term? And also, another question that we have from two of our leaders about how you can restore the trust in the Labor Party, and I'm wondering if there's some parallel process in terms of what can be done now in the lead up to potentially the next elections in another 50, 100, 120, 200 days. And I would love for you to touch on both of those things, both restoring trust in the Labor Party and also the impact of the protests.
Well, I think I said, about labor, and but I'm happily repeating it. I think it's essential to first and foremost take it out of the government, replacing the leadership with primaries, and start rebuilding it with new powers and with a new commitment by people who are not part of betraying, the voters. And I believe it's possible. So let's, join me, support me, help me do this, and let's see how it works. I don't know what those protests will lead to. In 2011, 1 million people took to the streets in Israel with a very, very strong discomfort from their financial, economical situation, the social, economic positions that they had, their possibilities. There was a huge unrest, and yet nothing happened. Nothing happened because we went to elections, and then in 2012, in 2009, Netanyahu built a coalition thanks to the votes that Ehud Barak, as the leader of Labor at the time, gave him. In 2012, we went to elections after this huge protest, and it was Yair Lapid and Tzipi Livni who gave him the mandates to form a government. So again, we're back to politics. It's not about the people. The people are voting against Netanyahu. It's about the political representation that constantly, our leaders have constantly since 2009 have given our mandates. The people's mandates that voted against Netanyahu have given it to him. We have to build this political body that will not do this, that will be able to represent people for what they meant when they voted. This is what I am convicted. This is my conviction, really. I want to build this thing. This is what I'm interested in. I want to change the reality in Israel. We can do this. It's so possible. We have, all the people in Israel. There's so much. Israel. You know how warm it is, how this familiarity between people, the creativity, the passion that people have. And as I said, the majority here wants a normal state. Normal in the sense that it will be free, it'll be democratic, it'll be fair. We can do this. We just need to work on it and not do the things that leftists do, and that is despair. They're giving up because they're so frustrated. And now I'm not being really sarcastic about it. I'm not, of course, putting anyone or anything down. And I can understand that it's extremely frustrating. You're going out and you're voting, and then your leaders are betraying you. But it's not over till it's over. It's not like there's no roller. um, it's in our hands. Again, we just need to get up on our lives. We have our work cut out for us. We just need to do it.
I want to ask you, I want to ask you one last question because it's a good J Street question, which is, what role do you think American Jews can play to be supportive of your goals?
Not give up on Israel and not give up on the progressive camp in Israel. I hope very, very much that I helped you understand the reality here. It's not that the country did not become right wing. Not everybody is Netanyahu. Israel is not Netanyahu. There are many people here who so desperately want to replace Netanyahu and to have, as I said, a state that is fair, that really works for ending the conflict with the Palestinians in a fair way and live here peacefully. Really, the materials are here. I need you to not only not give up on us, but realizing that we are, as I said, we've been facing what you are facing now for the past 4 years. We've been facing it and dealing with it for 11 years already. So we need more support from you. No, not less. We need much, much more support. Because with it, we certainly have better chances of winning and replacing not only Netanyahu, but the right in general, because it's not only about him. We have to change and to replace the right wing in government so we can do the things that we talked about. That's what I'm urging you to do.
So I just want to also echo all of the thanks for your leadership that I received in the Q&A. So many people that are thanking you, wondering how they can help you, and really appreciate all of our work on so many issues that are important to us as J Street. And I think the most important thing that I'm thinking of after your remarks is this word accountability, right? The accountability of leaders. And I think that it's so critical, and it's such an important point that you make about the accountability that the leaders have to the people that elected them. And unfortunately, as you laid out, that seems to be our greatest challenge today. How are leaders held accountable to the voters? And so I am truly inspired always by your vision and by your work to try to make things better, and you really do hold yourself accountable to those that elected you. And so thank you for that. I'm just going to say that for all of our viewers that have not joined yet the J School series, tomorrow is our last class of J School, which is J Street, American Jews, and the Israel Lobby. So I encourage you all to register for that. And look forward to future opportunities, Merav, to be in conversation with you. And thank you everyone for being with us this afternoon and evening. And look forward to seeing you all again soon.
Thank you again for having me. It's been a pleasure. Bye-bye.
Bye.